Hey, so we're here. We're at the top of the hour. It's 9:30. This is the Third Rail X Space. We do it every Friday at 9 o'clock. Thank you all for coming. Today we've got a special guest, Martin Shkreli, and he came to my attention years ago when my son told me about him. And my son was, I think, in high school at the time, and he was just such a huge fan of Martin. And Martin has got there's a lot of controversy surrounding Martin and so on. So I thought we'd get in a little bit of just trying to understand who he is and what kind of some of the past that happened and some of the things that are kind of funny and interesting, and then get into kind of what's going on now. He's been called everything from a financial prodigy to a disruptor, primarily in the biotech business, and one of the most controversial figures of his generation. He's done some interesting things. I think he offered $5,000 for a lock of Hillary Clinton's hair one time, which landed him in jail. and and then he had a number of. I think he bought the secret Wu-Tang Clan album that no one had ever heard for $2 million, and so there's a story about that. And it's in an interesting situation. He was prosecuted for, I think, securities fraud, and it's an interesting case because no one lost any money, and all his investors want to do more deals with him. But it was an interesting case of pissing off Hillary Clinton is always really dangerous. But at least he didn't suicide himself. So hey, Martin, welcome to the Third Rail. I'd love it if you would kind of introduce yourself and let's just get started chatting.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, guys. I loved listening to you in our illustrious green room as you were talking about some of the issues facing our country. So I'm just a pretty regular American businessman, Republican. I live in New York. I was born in New York. New York is a beacon for immigrants. My family came from Albania. They fled communism. Uh, they were in a refugee camp in Italy, made their way to America completely legally, of course. And they settled down here. They worked very hard, and they raised four kids. And one of their kids became fabulously wealthy and successful. And it was the American dream. And it's a lot's changing. My story has been talked about a lot, but at the end of the day, I don't worry about myself. I'm a strong individualist. I will persevere and succeed no matter what. I'm more worried about other people who are weaker or more suspect to influence and things like that. And the gradual erosion of some of the American values we all share is pretty stark and apparent. And I think for a lot of business people like me, the smart move is to keep your mouth shut. The smart move, every PR person you can hire, we actually hired a PR firm that was associated with the Clintons. It was so funny and ironic. And, every PR firm would tell you, just keep your mouth closed, it'll blow over. And I think so many business people eventually said, I can't. I can't let wokeism encroach into my company. I just have to do something. Even if it means, sadly, it's going to hurt me personally, professionally, and, in other ways. Vivek, who was one of my partners, was one of the first people to do this. And I was shocked when Vivek decided to push back on wokeism because he's another, New York guy. First look at him, you'd think he was a liberal, and you sort of see him, push back in New York City. And I noticed yesterday, really interesting. Trump held this fantastic dinner. Did you guys see that at all? The
Yeah.
round table with the business leaders of America. And he had, a very diverse group up there that, in essence, I mean, I'm not going to apologize for being a capitalist libertarian. This is what America's all about. We've got Google, we've got Apple, we've got Microsoft. No other country in the world has anything that comes close to it. And the amount of value that's created is not just a number. It's jobs. It's heart. It's our spirit. It shows American excellence. It's not just about how much profit does these companies make, which I do think is a marker of excellence. It's about just America in general. We have the greatest industry in the world because we have the smartest, most entrepreneurial, most hardworking people. We want to keep it that way. And we'll talk a lot about, our new mayor, our new incoming mayor over here in New York, and then also My beautiful wife has joined the call as well. And we'll talk about, we have a home in San Francisco and kind of what's happened in San Francisco as a predictor of what's happened in New York. There's so many things to talk about, but before I jump into that, I wanted to just go through one really interesting vignette for you. So there was this big roundtable. You had all the leaders of business, there. Trump's bringing them all together. You never saw this. I've never seen this in 40, 50 years, of watching or either studying history of, the kings of capitalism, kings and queens, sitting there talking about business and talking about investing in America and talking about their leadership. Only Trump could do this. And, I'm not necessarily the fan of every single thing Trump does. I'm not a sycophant. I'm a critic. But one person that I want to point out that was really interesting there was Sam Altman. And, Sam Altman's my wife's boss, for full disclosure. But, Sam, I'm a fan of Sam. He's built one of the most successful companies in history in a very short period of time. But he's San Francisco through and through. He's a proud gay man. And what's interesting is 10 years ago, if Sam Altman went to dinner or lunch, even roundtable lunch with President Trump, the whole San Francisco would be protesting. And every person at OpenAI and other companies would be boycotting it. And today, instead, everybody's praising each other. Everybody's happy. Business is flourishing. Wokeism is gone. And if anything, when I go to San Francisco, I see a huge amount of open-mindedness towards the right wing, huge amounts of right-wing people in the venture capital community, like good friend Joe Lonsdale. And, people are starting to get sick of it. And so now New York is kind of in the precipice of what's going to happen over here. And, whether, half the billionaires in New York have left and gone to Florida. And, I would say but they pay, disproportionate amount of the taxes. I had personal representatives at the IRS and state that just work on my taxes. That's their whole job. Is I am the Martin Shkreli tax person. And I'm a little guy. There's guys where there's whole teams of people, 10, 20 people assigned to just collecting the tax of one New Yorker. And when that New Yorker leaves, and gets driven out by a guy like Admani, it's pretty scary because where's the revenue going to come from? And Chicago's dealing with this. Detroit dealt with this. And it's not implausible that the city goes bankrupt. New York, atrophied in the 70s and almost went bankrupt for similar reasons. And people like Giuliani and even Bloomberg, who I'm somewhat of a fan of as a businessman, especially, maybe as a politician a little less. But, Bloomberg and Giuliani sort of cleaned up the city and got it back to tip-top shape. But it's almost like homeostasis where, we get this success and then we say, well, let's ruin it. And San Francisco did that. And again, the citizens got sick of it. Centrists, like our great friend Gary Tan that runs Y Combinator, a big institution in San Francisco, centrists and good Democrats said we had enough of this. And Republicans had the voice all of a sudden to come out of the closet and say, I'm a Republican and I live here and I work here and I'm scared about what's happening to the city. And San Francisco almost went down the tubes. But this AI revival is coming back in full force. And this time, it's a more centrist thing. So it's really cool to see that.
Yeah. No, that's great. So yeah, Martin, I was in the startup world for years, and I've been on X or Twitter since 2007, and I never discussed politics until Trump came to the forefront in 2016, and it's primarily because I had a house in Dallas and a family in Dallas, but I had a place in Soma, and where I would go during the week, and I pretended that I wasn't a Christian, and I pretended that I wasn't a conservative. I didn't talk about it, and I certainly wouldn't have tweeted anything about it. So I lived kind of under the radar, and I just accepted that was just a necessary evil. One of the things I'd like to ask you about is, given kind of the universe that you're sort of occupying right now, there were two things I wanted to say. One is I hear you had a child. I don't know if it's true. Is Torque's middle name Easy Money Stacks?
Yeah. So growing up in New York City, and then also going to jail for 5 years, I'm deeply steeped in the urban culture. And you mentioned the Wu-Tang Clan album earlier, and Easy Money Stacks is a Black people are fantastic. I love the culture in New York, and one of the great things that the deep urban Black community has taught us is to be extremely distrustful of government, and almost to a paranoia state. And this is a funny thing because as I went to jail, what I realized, I kind of left the hood, so to speak, growing up in Brooklyn, to a very poor family, and going to Manhattan and living the zillionaire lifestyle, and then going to jail and returning. Everyone in jail is impoverished. Everyone in jail is a minority, and I'd love to tell you more about that because it's rather interesting. But in jail, everyone has their government name, and then they have their street name. And the reasoning, of course, is that you don't want the government to know who you are, where you are. When this kid was born, the hospital people said, "Do you have ID?" And I said, "No, I don't." They said, "Well, what's your name?" I said, "It's none of your business." And they said, "Well, are you the father?" And I said, I was just kept my mouth shut. This danger. Why does he need a social security number? All of these questions kind of come up, and I'm sort of a you know, I'm not as deeply paranoid or libertarian as some people. Obviously, I told him my name, and he has a social security number now. But I do think that we live in a world that's a little scary in the sense that in some ways the social security number is supposed to be a benefit for you, but it's not optional, and it's sort of it can be a lot of people used to make fun of me by pointing out my prisoner number. They say, "Oh, you're inmate such and such, 229." I say, "Well, your social security number, 043." So, at the end of the day, they're tracking you too. You're just a number to the government as well.
Or did Sam Bankman-Fried ever take you up on your offer to give him advice on how to deal with prison life?
Yeah, yeah. Sam's an interesting cat. He's kind of a sociopath, right? In a lot of ways, the idea that he was
No.
was funding all these Republicans and then Democrats, and then now he's begging for a pardon. Tucker Carlson asked me how to get him on an interview, and I said, there's basically three or four routes, and there's one route where you can get the interview, but it gets Sam into a lot of trouble. And he took that route, and and Sam did this interview where he sort of pleaded and begged his case for clemency by President Trump. But I warned Sam that growing up in a liberal kind of like, I don't know, for lack of a better term, kind of pussy lifestyle would not endear him to other prisoners. Like they didn't play around with that stuff. They want to be in prison with other men. And if you are kind of a pansy, you're not going to survive. And I sort of explained that to him, and his biggest concern was not having the internet. And I'm just like, you got to start throwing that out the window, man. Don't worry about the internet. Worry about that culo. And kidding about, but I heard you guys are Latino. But in all seriousness, yeah, prison is funny. There is a emerging trend, and thank God for President Trump. And again, not a fan of every single darn thing he does, but this is one positive thing. There was a big trend to diversify the prison population. Believe this or not, the stats are pretty clear. It's 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Hispanic. The white population in prison is almost overwhelmingly pedophiles. Very few people know this. Now, unfortunately, I had that experience. It's sex offenders. So the amount of white non-sex offenders, I would venture to say, is maybe a couple percent of prison. And some of the people in the BOP, the DOJ, and the White House of the Democratic Party said, we got to change this. We got to stop looking at crime as something we prosecute and start looking at it also through a DEI and equality lens. And increasingly, guys like me came under more scrutiny. There was a wonderful executive from Google who got indicted the same way I did. And this is another trick that I can reveal to you guys that's really fascinating. Every lawyer in America at one point works for the government, especially when you go to a big law firm. You clerk for the DA, you are assistant DA, AUSA, something like that. And then you go to a big law firm, and they pay you the big bucks to do whatever. But ultimately, if you work at Google and you do something wrong, and Google's paying big law firm 10 million bucks a year, and you, Mr. Muse, did something to piss off Google. Maybe you started a competitor. And this is exactly what happened, by the way, to Mr. Lewandowski. Funny name, very, very similar to another guy. And he leaves Google, goes to arch rival Uber, and Google's general counsel and lawyers, they call up their big law firms they're paying millions of dollars and say, hey, we got to report a crime here. This guy left Google, and he's taking trade secrets, and he's taking them to a rival. Now Google's a $2 trillion company that isn't too worried about trade secrets, but they're trying to show this guy a lesson. And what do you know? The person at the law firm worked in the exact department of the DOJ that prosecutes this exact thing, and they indict the guy and arrest him. And it's easy to make a crime happen. Every single one of us listening right now is a criminal. You just don't know it yet. And the question is, when are they going to hit you with it? And I think, I had the displeasure of dealing with Letitia James many times here in New York. It seemed like she only existed to prosecute Trump and then secondarily myself. And I lost a case with her to the tune of 60 million. And, now the question is, maybe she's going to go to jail. And I don't think that tit for tat is healthy. My great friend Bill Pulte is going off on Lisa Cook for the same kind of like small time stuff, saying, well, nobody's above the law. Well, that's true. But prosecutors should have discretion. The same way they should never brought cases against Trump or me, we should not have to retaliate, so to speak. And again, maybe I'm just, calling a spade here. But, these small crimes, we should spend our time on big crimes that are really dangerous. Obviously, nobody should get off, scot-free or skate on something that's, like this. But at the same time, part of the reason that you have this tit for tat is you did it to our people. So now we're going to do it to your people. And that's not a great road to go down, I don't think.
Well,
no, definitely not. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, hey, Martin. You say, first off, it strikes me that the Democrats play lawfare, and a lot of the accusations, particularly with Trump, and those are geared politically.
Totally.
And a lot of them are fake charges. They were, pardon the pun, trumped up charges, and the Democrats often do that. They throw smoke and they throw shade, because they want to be able to say, see, the other side does it too, so don't prosecute us. It's often what leftists are already breaking the law because they don't believe the law is applied.
Let me tell you this, Chris. I mean, the second you are indicted, you are presumed guilty, because the federal government is a 97% conviction rate, and in the Southern District of New York, it's 99.5. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure the government's ever been 99.5% right about anything. And, they just sort of wield that sword. And the trial process is wildly unfair. I'm very lucky. I beat 5 out of my 8 charges, which almost never happens because it was a bullshit case. But if you throw 8 charges against somebody, it's kind of like throwing 8 punches. It's hard to dodge them all. And it was very tough to fight. And I spent huge amounts of money, defending myself. But you're basically presumed guilty instead of presumed innocent. And the media is the accomplice here. I mean, the media is teed up. In fact, funny story in my case, it is illegal to disclose grand jury proceedings. It is literally a crime in the United States of America. So the person that does this is the prosecutor. And the prosecutor says, oh, dear Bloomberg, who actually I compete with, dear Bloomberg, here's a story. We're about to arrest Martin Shkreli. Or at least we're investigating him. Well, they report that. And now my business has to suffer. Now I have to suffer. And, I've done nothing wrong, but this reporting is leaked by the prosecutor, who's now become criminal himself. And I asked my lawyers, why don't we pursue this? And they said, Martin, this guy's kind of an idiot. If we pursue it, they'll kick him off the case and they'll bring on somebody smarter. And so he didn't pursue it. But, there was I believe the
Wow.
Attorney General of Pennsylvania was arrested for doing exactly this, leaking to the press that, somebody's about to be arrested, indicted, or investigated. And so, it's a really corrupt, insane system, and nobody cares about it because you say, well, why should we care about a felon's rights? And it's like, well, sure, but until the finger's pointed at you, you might care. And increasingly, that finger is being pointed at people like the darn president of the United States. Now, let me tell you real quick, I know I'm babbling here, but in prison, I met some of the biggest criminals on planet Earth. And these people have never, ever racked up 4 separate crimes in their life. I mean, I'm talking about their entire life getting indicted on 4 separate crimes. It's virtually impossible. In fact, in the annals of crime, only John Gotti ties President Trump with 4 separate indictments on 4 separate occasions over a lifetime of crime as a mob boss. So the point is to find 4 separate crimes in the span of 4 years. I mean, it's virtually impossible.
It was all bullshit. We all know it was bullshit. And and something else too, Martin, you mentioned, and because my time is short because I got to go start prepping for the TV show. You mentioned about Google being American and $2 trillion company. See, I look at Google as being a wholly owned subsidiary of communist China.
Why would you say
an American company, an American company that is sold out to the values of communist
Why
China.
Why do you say that? I'll challenge you on that.
Yeah, because of their censorship regimen.
Okay, yeah.
And because if China doesn't like it, they're not going to allow you to say it on their platform.
I don't know if that's how far they go, because I think they're banned in China. And I agree with you that they censor a lot and that they do automated censorship. It's very, very kind of crappy. And, they have such a big power that by influencing a search result, they can determine the outcome of an election.
Yeah.
And, they've tried to do that too, which is astonishing. But I don't know that they have that much allegiance to China, but, we can agree
they're
to
still
disagree.
doing it, by the way. Yeah, they're still doing it. And that's again, we have so many people, and I think, and this is what I wanted you to address, that those in the business community that look at China as a potential business opportunity, and to expand their business and to grow their business. As a capitalist, and is actually a free enterprise guy, I'm not really a capitalist. I'm more free enterprise because I don't believe the government ought to be putting their thumbs on the scale at all.
Yeah.
If you've got a good widget, you should be able to sell it. If not,
Absolutely.
the government shouldn't be bailing your ass out.
Yeah.
But my fundamental question is this about corporate America, because you're seeing a whole bunch of nations around the planet buying into this propaganda. Hell, a lot of Democrats are pushing this propaganda that America's on the decline, China's on the ascendancy, and you better throw in your lot with communist China just to get this so-called burgeoning market of theirs access to it. What is your thought on businesses that are selling out to communist China and maybe turning their back on what it is to be an American?
Yeah, I think there's, it's a huge mistake. I've never done business in China, and there's a reason. One, I mean, you set foot in there, you do the wrong thing, they'll arrest you. And that's, you're in foreign territory, and there's no reason to trust them. Secondly, China's one of these things where they'll open up the market to you and then kind of yank the rug out from under you. I mean, you go in there and you teach them how to do your business. A guy like me go there and teach them about pharmaceuticals. They say, sure, we'll pay you $100 million for the next few years, but in about 6 years, the entire biopharma industry has, unfortunately, a lot of that innovation has gone to China. They've learned how to do what we used to, only us used to be able to make, things like really complicated drugs like antibody drug conjugates are some of the hardest drugs in the world to make. They were made in Seattle originally. And it is American pride that you could make such a technical achievement. And now Chinese are leading at that. It's really surprising. How'd that happen? Well, a bunch of American companies went over to China and said, we want to sell 100 million, a paltry sum to these Chinese people who can't even afford our drugs. And lo and behold, quickly China became, a big force in this field. So now, it's basically just IP theft. And, I worry quite a bit. And again, I mentioned my wonderful wife who's sitting here. I worry quite a bit about Chinese infiltration of American institutions. I mean, I love Chinese Americans. But when you go to some of these tech companies, virtually everyone is Chinese. And there's nothing wrong with that on its face. There are many wonderful Chinese Americans. But you sit there and say, am I sure that every person at a wonderful company like OpenAI or Anthropic or Anduril or whatever, Palantir, should all these people be Chinese? And, are some of them taking this technology and bringing it back, so to speak, home? And it's it's just something that raises my eyebrow. I certainly don't want to be accused of being racist. A lot of Chinese people I really love, a lot of them love America. But it is fascinating to see an entire company, virtually completely Chinese immigrants often, or Indian immigrants, and almost no kind of people that just grew up here and were Americans to start. So it's just a little odd. A lot of H1B visa folks who, should they be working at our most elite companies? It is a question that a lot of people have asked. Obviously, I think some of them should. There's a lot of talent out there. If people want to come to America and assimilate and be a part of our wonderful nation, that's how we grew our nation, with people like Albert Einstein coming to America and many others. But, it's odd when the whole damn company is, completely Chinese or Indian. I struggle to understand that sometimes.
Well, I watched my father. My father had a chip company in Silicon Valley, and they would have Chinese guys who would work for them, and invariably they would monitor kind of what they were doing, and invariably they would catch some of these guys sending IP designs, et cetera, back to China. Then they would contact the FBI. They would have the evidence that the FBI guy would come out, and then the FBI guy would basically describe that there's nothing much we could really do. You probably should just fire him, and there you go. So they had this one guy. My dad just wouldn't let it go, and he found out that they had hired him from Cisco, where he had done the same thing, and Cisco had fired him, but they didn't tell anybody why they fired him, because the law in California prevents you from telling anybody why you fire people. So this guy had worked evidently at 6 or 7 of our most advanced chip companies and was just sending everything back, and he never got punished. I don't know. Eventually, everybody figured out his name. So
and again, there's not much money out there in China. If Google opened up to China, China's going to force you to use Alibaba. China's going to force you to use the other companies. There's a reason Mark Zuckerberg learned Chinese. He's a clever guy. And I told Barron Trump, who's telling me that Elon was the guy and he was the man and we love Elon. I said, don't sleep on Zuckerberg. He's very shrewd. He's a tremendous businessman, and make sure you talk to him as well. And Zuck learned Chinese to warm himself up to that market. And it's something that I would do. It's really subversive move to try to get that billion people market. And they shut him out. They said, there's no way we're letting you in here. And, we know that you're too powerful. You come into China, you're going to take over China. You're going to be able to control our people's thoughts. You're going to be able to control what they see. There's only one person that can do that. That's the CCP. And, he was shut out of China, but he tried his hardest. And, I don't think there's much money out there, to be honest. China's economy, they stopped reporting unemployment. I mean, that's insane. Nobody asks any questions in China.
Communist. That's what communists do, man. Leftists lie. It's a Salcedo Show axiom. Leftists lie. They always lie because the truth is they suck. Communism sucks. Socialists suck. And they can't compete. And they know it, and we know it, and so all they're going to do is lie.
The estimate of their unemployment is around 40%, 40.
Holy moly.
We're at 4. And this is what socialism looks like. And Madbani, or whatever his name is, wants to bring it to New York City, which, New York City is a funny place. I grew up here my whole life, 42 years in New York City. It's a melting pot for sure. But what's really crazy is, and I know this may be a little controversial, but heck, why not? Jews helped build the city. Now, I'm not Jewish, and I have no reason, my wife's not Jewish, we have no reason to sort of do anything but be clear and, call a spade a spade. And when the massacre, the terrorist attack happened from Hamas in Israel, you have people in New York, which is almost like a very Jewish identifying city, protesting, against a terrorist attack, for the terrorists. And
dude, I had the Zionists of America on the show yesterday, and I said, look, even after everything that's happened in the Democrat Party, which is the source of anti-Semitism in America, I believe. I mean, I'm not going to suggest that there are no right-wing people who are anti-Semites, but the vast majority of Jew hatred and Israeli hatred comes from the American left. And I said to this lady, I go, aren't you a little shocked that you have so many Jews, for example, in New York and left-wing markets, still voting Democrat, even though they are the party of anti-Semitism? And she wouldn't even go there. She just wanted.
It's changing a lot. It's changing a lot. Most of the wealthy business people I know in New York are they've had it. They're never going to go, Democrat again. 24 years ago, we had the worst day of my life, almost, quite frankly, to the day. It was 9/11, and that galvanized me as a patriot and as a Republican for the rest of my life. And ever since then, I almost died that day, as many people who actually did. It meant that terrorism is on our shores. It came to New York City. And now 24 years later, we've forgotten, we make jokes about 9/11, and, Hamas wages one of the most terrible attacks at a music festival. I mean, really, this horrific thing. And we're celebrating it. We're trying to defend them. I mean, it's really insane.
Yeah.
Hey
Amen.
guys, it's the top of the hour. It's 10 o'clock. This is the Third Rail X space. If you haven't shared the space, please go ahead and share it. We are joined by Chris Salcedo every Friday, 9 to 10, and it's 10. So Chris typically leaves us at this point. He runs over to prep for his Newsmax show. We're going to continue on with Martin. Chris, did you want to say anything before you headed out?
Just some parting words, guys. Always appreciate you joining the Third Rail. Some days I can stay a little bit longer. Some days I can't. Again, hat tip to @Amuse for doing all of the fantastic preparation and making the connections with Martin. It's been a fascinating discussion to hear it. We'll put in a plug, as you know, I have written a book called The Rise of the Liberty-Loving Latino. It gets published, available for sale in December 9th. So the pre-sale saves you a couple of bucks. If you want to check out the biggest political revolution to hit this country since the formation of the Republican Party, we detail it there in the book. Hope to see you guys for the last 4 o'clock slot broadcast of the Chris Salcedo Show on Newsmax. We're going to 5 o'clock starting Monday. Much love, everybody, and can't thank you enough for being here on this X Space, the Third Rail. Alex, appreciate you, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so Martin, since we've got you here and you sort of occupy the universe of the administration, and you're in New York City, there's been a lot of speculation about that Trump is under a lot of pressure from some of his friends in New York City to come out strongly against Zohran Mamdani, and but there's some counter pressure that maybe we as a party would love to run against Zohran Mamdani, that if he won, it might be maybe the best thing that could happen to us, because it would just give us something and an idea to run against, not just in New York, but nationally. Are you hearing anything about how the administration is feeling about him and what the plan is? I know that there have been rumors that Adams is being offered certain jobs and different things in the private sector, board positions, things like that, to make it smoother for him to transition out. And there's the Republican candidate has also been offered some things potentially for him to drop out. What are you hearing, and do you have much information on that at all?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of donors out there who, they pony up a huge amount of money to have a seat at the table and to hear these things first. And it's sort of a sport. Instead of watching football, you do this. It's an expensive hobby, and it's not something every now and then I get roped into all this intrigue and I'm involved, but it's something I have a day job. I try to stick to that. So I don't have any inside baseball. I don't really want any, but I'll just tell you how I feel. I mean, I do think you're right that running against him, there's an old saying, never interrupt your opponent making a mistake. And I feel like, running this guy is just going to be fodder for potentially even a J.D. Vance victory in a few years. And, if you look at, does America want J.D. Vance or a surrogate guy like Mamdani? What party do you want representing you? I think that's a pretty easy choice. New York's ultra-liberalism is not what America wants. And, New York, the biggest, most successful city in America, it's the mayor of New York often, it seems like a surrogate for the president of the United States. And, it's a reflection. And it's one of these things where the mayor doesn't actually have that much power. I mean, the guy can't do anything but run the NYPD and apparently hate them. But I think he said something about queer police, I don't even remember what he said about that, but it was very just idiotic and bizarre. And he was very anti-police. Now he's pro-police. Police are needed in New York. It's a dangerous town. And at one point, it was one of the most dangerous towns in America. And, as we had a shooting, the other, a few weeks ago, a lot of people are praising the police and their work on how they did it. But, we have so many homeless people. When you jump on the subway in New York, there's a 50-50 you're going to be accosted by a drunk derelict that, should be in a mental hospital or in drug treatment. And, that's not a city people want to live in. It's not a city people want to invest in. And it happened in Chicago, and Citadel went to Miami. It's happening in New York, and many billionaires are going to Miami. So I think that Manmani is going to, defund the police, as he said previously, his own words. That's going to make New York City worse. It's going to suck for people like me for 5 years or 10 years. But, I'll be fine. It's not the people like me who are going to suffer. It's going to be the middle class in New York that suffers. It's going to be the people going home from the subway at 10 o'clock after working a second job in East Brooklyn. They're going to be the ones getting mugged. Park Avenue is not going to change. So I think there's, it's a very kind of, like most things Democrats do, it has good intent, but it works the opposite way. And it's really sad to see. So we'll see what happens. But I think you let him win. I mean, he's going to win.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make a difference. But
I guess so. I mean, it just seems like it's a train. It's a locomotive, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. My little guy, his girlfriend goes to school in New York City, and he's about a 45-minute train ride away. And so I guess she always wanted to live in New York City, and it was a big dream of hers, and so on and so forth. And so he went ahead and got an apartment that they share there in Hell's Kitchen, and he tells me about it. I think he's kind of miserable because he goes to kind of an idyllic campus, and it's very nice. And where he lived was, right on campus. He lived in a high rise right next door, and he just had such a great little life. And then now he literally tells me about he's stepping over people actively smoking crystal meth, right outside his door. He's not even kidding.
I grew up in New York my whole life, and I'd never seen a guy do heroin right on the middle in 34th Street. Now, You might see that in the Bronx or something like that, but you're seeing that right in the middle of the city, the most prosperous city in the universe. And yeah, it's sad to see. I think that, what does that mean and why is it happening? That's a question that's not easy to understand, right? Like, these deaths of despair, they happen in Appalachia, they happen, all around the world. And, it's I don't think it's as simple as saying, let's fund more homelessness activities, which is how Democrats view it. So let's just pay for more homelessness groups and support. You have to go at the root. Same thing with crime. In prison, they spend a huge amount of money on guys like me who went to prison. You don't need to spend money on a person like me, certainly going to prison, but the idea that, we maybe spend 50, 60K a year to house, prisoners. And you're sitting there wondering, is this money well spent, or should we think about spending money on enforcing great American values like two parents at home, for example, and other, kind of, well-meaning things. And I feel like, people like Trump and J.D. Vance are pretty decent role models. Trump's not a perfect role model, but he's also, said things like he's never taken a sip of alcohol in his life. He's never done a drug. J.D. looks like he's pretty, good role model, for example. And then you sort of look at, folks like Madmani, and you wonder if that's the guy who's never had a job in his life, who's never worked hard in his life, who's silver spoon kid, is that the kind of person that we want doling out, family values? Or is it, somebody who actually has a family? Now, again, Trump's not perfect, 3 divorces, the porn star, thing. But, at the end of the day, I think that, sort of, a problem, homelessness and things like that, goes all the way down to drug abuse, the huge amount of opioid addiction in the world. All these things are kind of, stem from something. And that's something that we can't put our finger on how to fix.
Flipping to new topic, thinking about cryptocurrency, and I love your kind of thoughts on the administration's embrace of cryptocurrency, particularly the Trump family's embrace of it. And I do recall maybe a year or two ago, did you not do some kind of Barron Trump kind of crypto project?
Yeah. Barron and I tried to do something, and I think that family is pretty complicated. I get some inside views on just how, difficult it is to be a Trump. I think that there's a lot of competition in that family. It's always tough as well when there's kids from different marriages, and Barron is a very young man compared to some of his brothers. And so, I think the interest in crypto in a lot of ways is a get rich quick thing. I think that there's no other way to put it. Now, I bet you the Trump brothers would say otherwise. But at the end of the day, it is a bit of a, some people would use a bad word. I'm not going to use a bad word. It is an opportunistic thing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, by the way. So that's the key difference, is that people like Elizabeth Warren will say, oh, well, look at this. This guy's thieving from the people. Well, I'd rather you steal from my face than from behind my back. And I think that it's not stealing, of course. But the point is, how did Elizabeth Warren get $250 million? I mean, that is a bigger question. At least Trump's a businessman. He's not saying he's not a businessman. He's not saying he's not an opportunist. And I expect capitalists in America to do what they do, which is make money, and that's fine. But it's when people like Elizabeth Warren or AOC or whoever, they start shoving millions of dollars in their pocket while also saying out of the other side of their mouth that they're not doing that. They represent the average person. Well, look at Bernie Sanders with his, it does it as well. And I feel like that hypocrisy, I don't. So I guess in short, I don't love the stuff that the Trump family is necessarily doing in crypto, but I can't blame them and I can't call them hypocrites. And we all want to make money, including the president. Why shouldn't he make money? I do think it's disingenuous when these presidential libraries get stoked with hundreds of millions of dollars and they're virtually bribes. Hillary Clinton, of course, is my number one target on this kind of subject. So, at the end of the day, let him make his money. He's made a fortune in crypto. Crypto's a weird space. It's kind of a big Ponzi scheme in a lot of ways. There is some future there. There's some opportunity there. It's exciting and interesting, but it has a lot of weird game theory with, if we replace the dollar with this other kind of money, then, well, what happens to the dollar? What happens to America? And I had these discussions with that family, and it's a very interesting, state of affairs. But regardless of whether crypto is something that's technologically useful in a free society, one of the things that I'd like you to chew on for a second is crypto was born in 2008 out of the crisis of bailouts, the crisis of banks failing. And the person or people that made it said, we're sick of this. In fact, it's so clear that on the original block of the blockchain is a newspaper photograph of a bailout of a major bank. And it was sort of a symbol of, this has to stop. We can't let AOC print money for the rest of eternity because they feel like it. And it's not like Trump's reducing the deficit, by the way, either. So I'm going to make this crypto. And one of the other reasons crypto was made was AML. I don't want JP Morgan to control my life. I want to take my life into my own hands. Why should I let a bank, cancel me because of something I tweeted? Bank can say, no, we don't want your money. And so you can get debanked, and that's happened many times, including to me. So I think that when it comes to crypto, the reasoning is all there. But what I want you to chew on is, if the government goes in the other direction and now frees up things like censorship in banks and lowers the deficit, et cetera, the need for crypto is marginally less there. You're a business person, the idea of a marginal utility, it sort of is a little less important to have a censorship-free currency because, well, the government's not censoring you anymore. But if we get to a Madmani as president, well, that's when you need Bitcoin really bad because, the dollar's tainted by a government that wants to just water it down, dilute the hell out of it, inflate the hell out of it, and spend the hell out of it on entitlements that, quite frankly, we can't afford. So I think the case for Bitcoin is dropping a little bit because we're having this homeostasis where politics are getting back to normal and business is getting back to normal, and they're at least they're talking about cutting the deficit. Maybe they're not doing it yet.
Well, I think that there's all these different use cases for crypto in terms of tethered, cross-border, settlement type products, and those are really helpful.
Absolutely.
Those are things that we need. But then you have the meme coins, which is what I think of as like basically unregulated individual lotteries.
Yes.
So I can set up a lottery this morning, and normally I couldn't do a lottery. It's illegal in every single state, but since we call it a meme coin, I'm allowed to do it, and which right. I think is fascinating, and eventually it won't be legal. They're going to regulate it away. Yeah.
Hey, poor countries love the lottery. Haiti, a third of their economy is lottery. Albania, where I'm from, almost had a complete total economic collapse due to a chain letter scam. So, our stock market right now resembles a lottery. And,
If you're if you're buying a meme coin right now, the other guy on the other side of the transaction, 1 out of 3 times lives in Nigeria.
right.
I mean, that's who your the other side
Yeah.
is of the
Yeah, we're,
transaction.
we're in a bit of a bubble. I mean, uh, on Robinhood, you can gamble on sports. It doesn't. Could you imagine going to your
No,
broker at Citigroup and saying, "Yeah, let's buy 1,000 shares of Microsoft and put $200 in the Jets this week."
why not? That seems completely reasonable.
Yeah, I mean the
Well,
gamble culture. I think Anthony Pump has talked about this, that the amount of gambling in America is at an all-time high, and it's almost an addiction, especially with younger people. Most people don't get to spend a lot of time around younger people, but I run a software company, and we get a lot of guys who are 19, 20 joining the company, and gambling is just a pure addiction in that age market. It's really sad how companies like Stake, which has Drake as its ambassador,
yeah.
they're basically poisoning these kids with this idea that they should be gambling all day. It's really terrible.
Yeah, one of my son's roommates, um, basically very smart guy, PhD level guy, but he basically is just all he does is gamble all day long, and that's kind of his thing. And he's basically like, well, I just don't even think I'm going to go get a job. I'm just going to stay gambling, and he makes enough money to do that to live a great lifestyle. And so many kids are being taught this. I wonder. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing if you're a probability PhD and you're working everything out and doing it carefully, but it's another
They're all
thing.
math. They're all math guys, so they're pretty
Yeah, I
smart.
think those
So
guys, they do what they do, but the guy that's taking $5,000 and buying, a wheat stock or a quantum computing stock or some other like kind of.
oh, you're big time short quantum computing,
I
right?
am, I am, but it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
this feverish. I don't want to pick on quantum too much, but the EVTOL companies, the nuclear companies, there's a lot of bubble out there. AI even starting to get there. Are we gambling in the stock market as much as we're gambling in sports, and then we're gambling in meme coins? What are we not gambling?
Right. Well, hey, switching topics. Hey, if you've got a question for Martin, put your hand up.
Tom
Oh,
is,
hey, Tom.
yeah.
Tom, why don't you go ahead? Tom, jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the amount spent by companies like Stake and these others, which, there's a long list, but they're spending money in state legislatures across America trying to get gambling in legally via the internet, right? And they don't even have to open up casinos. They can go the back door, and the you can't ignore that what they've been trying to get into every single one, including Texas legislature
Okay,
spending I don't know how much. It's a large sum of money,
I'll
but that's a lobby that's growing.
I'll give you some inside baseball there. I mean, I heard on extremely good authority that the Stake founders and other people at Stake were supposed to get knighted, and that they bought the way out of it. And very few Stake employees are in America. It's basically an Australian guy. Don't want to cast aspersions at anybody, but I do think this is eroding, our country's kind of, credibility. And imagine our new generation, instead of growing up and discovering quantum mechanics and, the next innovations, that they're just people that worry about, are the Jets going to cover the 3 points from the Colts? That's just not a productive use of time. I mean, it's even the stock market, making the stock market participation is all-time high. And that is a bad thing. The stock market is for professionals. It really is not for individuals. Every day, one of my friends is here snaking. We sort of try to pop the bubble whenever people gamble in biotech stocks because it's something we know. But a sucker is born every minute, and people want to throw money and gamble. And this record participation, it sounds like it's a good thing. We want people to invest, sure, but they're not investing responsibly, and they're doing it in inflating stocks. The last time this happened was the dot-com bubble, which I was there for. It's where I started my career, and it's going to end the same way. With Robinhood is doing this like gamification of investing. It's not a game. It's very hard to make 5-10% a year in the markets, and people will take their paycheck, chuck it into some call options. 0-day call options, for example, have zero utility other than gambling. So it's just one of these things where we are gamifying, the investment world. We're gambling. We're going down a road where, for example, creators, we're a creator, I'm a creator, but more and more you have guys, and again, learning this from Barron and his friends, heroes that are Aiden Ross and Andrew Tate instead of heroes that are Palmer Luckey or someone like that, Joe Lonsdale. Those guys are heroes. Aiden Ross, again, I'm sure he's a lovely guy, but these aren't people that we should be looking up to as quote unquote creators. The idea that YouTube is the is what most kids want to grow up and stream for a living is really scary. And gambling, on the other hand, and tying even those two together, all of these things are really concerning.
Well, let's switching topics to a very, very important topic to me. I'd love to know like the kind of how it got started, what happened, and then where things stand now with regard to the Wu-Tang Clan album, if you don't mind sharing that story with us.
Yeah, so there's still some litigation there. It's kind of a funny story. I bought the album for 1.5 million and I sold it for 2.4. And I was very happy because I thought the album was basically close to worthless. I marked it on my books at around 500K. And so in my criminal case, I had to pay the government 8 million, and I had a big estate to choose which, how I would pay the 8 million. So I paid it mostly cash, but I considered, should I sell this stock? Should I, sell this thing? Should I redeem from that thing? And I looked at the album and I said, this thing isn't worth anything. And at the same time, the NFT boom happened. And so when the NFT boom happened, I said, well, this is kind of like an NFT. And I put some feelers out there, and we got these just complete morons to buy the album for 2.4 million. And what's even funnier is the guy who bought it actually flipped it to them for 4 million. So I was kind of shortchanged 1.3 million, that's fine. But those guys who bought it are this crypto collective. There's a lot of dumb people in crypto. And these guys bought it, and they never signed a deal with me that said that I can't have copies of the album. They just bought the physical plastic. And, we're sort of in litigation about this. And, I explained to the judge, I mean, if there was, an agreement that I can never have a copy of this anymore, I don't know, Your Honor, I can't find it. Of course, it doesn't exist. So these guys just made a really funny, terrible deal. But I deal a lot in these kinds of things. I was approached to broker $250 million of Pokemon cards the other day. And I don't know who would buy these, but there are people. Apparently, it's a $60 billion market. And again, these are Pokemon cards. They've just, in fact, have gone up in value by 50% just in the last 6 to 9 months. So we're in a weird bubble. Money is basically just flowing out of the Fed, and it's a nonstop thing. And it's a really sad thing, Mr. Muse, because, I come from the biotech industry. And the biotech pharma industry, which I'm now banned from, thanks to an activist judge, this biopharma industry is a great industry. We or they, we're trying to make great treatments for people to save their lives, to extend health. And it is the most kicked industry, most beaten up industry, hated industry for no reason. And, a little bit partially not my fault, but it's the worst industry in the stock market. The whole stock market's at all-time highs, kicking ass. The biopharma industry is just being pummeled. And it's a really sad state of affairs. Again, kids don't want to go and become biotech engineers. They want to work at AI companies, or they want to meme all day and be creators. So it's a really kind of, we're going in such a weird direction as a country. It's so concerning.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. So have you heard of these? So this is kind of a little bit off topic, but maybe slightly interesting. So you're familiar with what a donor advised fund is?
Yeah.
They've got a pretty big one that's grown, I don't know, it's $20 billion in assets. And some guys out of Houston, and I think they were NFT guys originally, so crypto. So basically, they're allowing people to donate any crypto product, any asset to it at whatever the value is that's on the exchange that they have. So just your meme coin, pop it on there.
I know this fraud.
So I would love your thoughts on that. This is becoming more and more common. I feel like, isn't it so obviously fraud that someone will step in, or are they going to allow this to continue on for a while?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, crime is a funny thing. It happens before your nose, and then all of a sudden, as the law, our legal system is a case law system. So there's no law that prohibits anything specific. And the question is, does thing X fall under law Y? And the answer is we don't know until we find out. And so our legal system is an experiment-based system. And, you don't want to be the experiment, is what I learned. it's very easy to sort of indict those people and say, well, this is tax fraud. You know, let's bring you in, let's go to the jury, and the jury's going to say, yes, it's tax fraud. And the real action starts at the circuit level where they say, well, is it really tax fraud? You know, what does the rest of the case law mean? What does the Constitution say, et cetera, et cetera? You know, I think that this actually cuts to a really big thing in my case. In my case, I marked the value. This is why I was arrested. A lot of people don't know this. It's very, very intricate. I marked the value of my biotech company, which would end up being worth billions. I marked it at 25 million because that's where we raised capital. And this is called the last sale rule. Like, it's a very traditional way to mark an investment. And my prosecutor said, he just started the company. How could it be worth 25 million overnight? And if only that person knew what AI companies are now worth overnight. 2 billion, 10 billion, et cetera, a paltry 25 million. And I said, well, it's worth 25 million because that's what people paid for it. And that's the last sale. Now, the problem is that's very reasonable. And at the end of the day, my biotech company we IPO'd. We had one of the most successful biotech companies that year of any biotech company that got started that year. I'm very proud of it. And, you know, the problem is if I start the A Muse NFT and I sell it to my wife for $1,000, it's now worth $1,000. If she sells it to my brother for $25,000, well, now it's worth $25,000. And if he donates it and writes it off, well, he gets $25,000 tax write-off. And, you know, this is basically just a scam. And, you know, you just don't do things like this. You know,
well, it's even more pernicious than that. So imagine this. So you and I, we start a meme coin together, and I own half, you own the other half, and then we basically just inflate the value of that up through trading, and then I hold mine, and you donate your half. And the donor advised fund can't sell your half, so they're just going to be a holder. So now we've basically got locked liquidity. And now I'm able to go ahead and inflate it even faster.
Well, what are you doing? What are you doing at 3 o'clock? Let's do it. In all seriousness, it's one of these things where it goes back to the law stuff we were talking about earlier. You have, you know, the way people think law works and the way it actually works is just so wildly different. You have a U.S. attorney. This person's a politician. They don't do anything. You have 50 AUSAs, right? They sit there and their job's supposed to prosecute crime, but they're human beings. They care about where they're going in life. They don't really care about the crime, which is the funny part. They absolutely don't care about the crimes. That is totally incidental to their career as an attorney. They look at themselves as, I'm an attorney. I want to be the most successful attorney I can be. I'm an AUSA for 5 years, maybe 8, maybe 2, but then I'm going to Paul Weiss. Then I'm going to Ropes and Gray. I'm not fucking trying to be a government servant, but I will pretend that I am for the next 3 years. And what crimes can I prosecute that help my career? And yeah, I want bad guys off the street, so do you. Everybody does, including the AUSA. But which bad guys? Which bad guys are going to get me good press conferences?
I was sitting in the room with the kid, these 20-something kids that launched President Milei's meme coin back in February.
Oh boy.
And they were convinced they were all going to go to jail and everything was going to be terrible and stuff. And then I realized they are the same kids that launched Melania's token.
Right.
And I was like, oh, well, you guys are probably fine. And so then I call up some people that we knew, and the turns out Trump's attorney, his appellate attorney, was partners with the guy that was just appointed the AUSA for New York, for Southern District. And so guess what? we made a couple calls and said, hey, do you think it's likely that he would get prosecuted for this given these sets of facts? And the guy was like, oh, no, absolutely not. I think that's completely fine. I don't think you have to worry whatsoever. And so it's literally just because the political circumstance, right. Those crimes won't be investigated. They won't be prosecuted. It is what it is. And it's held up. There's nothing is going to happen probably as a result.
I mean, the funny thing about life is that, you got to take the fastballs with the curveballs. And, I got this really weird curveball. I didn't like it, but I dust myself off, get back on the course and say, I'm not going to let it change my life. And most people, this kind of thing ruins their life. I had a friend who unfortunately killed himself after being indicted for insider trading. And, that kind of, I feel so bad for him and his family, but, you have to be a little bit more resilient than that. And, I'm extremely resilient, but I think that you know, it's just such a sad thing to see it happen. But the luck, for me, the bad luck of being the last guy to get canceled before the media sort of collapsed, in essence, was bad luck. 6 months later, I'd be like the rest of the people in the business world that just are defiant and say, I'm going to do what I want. And Elon and others have taken that path. I'm so happy for them. And I don't begrudge anyone, or bad luck happens all the time to everybody, and you just have to deal with it. I think the good luck that smile fortunes on those guys, well, great for them. But if you live a life of deceit, and you live a life of cheating, and you live a life of, rug pulling and taking things that aren't yours, it'll catch up to you. It's going to catch up one way or another. And if it doesn't catch up to you, as a financial or legal thing, it's still catching up in your heart and your mind. I mean, I have a guilt-free conscience. I've always done the best for myself and the people around me. Always put in the most amount of effort. Sometimes it's worked great, sometimes it's not. But you can sleep at night. I think it's these people that do stuff like this, where they're stealing, as much as 50 or 100 million. Well, look, 50 or 100 million doesn't last that long, especially if you're that kind of a person. Even if you don't pay your taxes, that money's here today, gone tomorrow, and you still have to deal with being talentless. You still have to deal with being a thief, all those things. And it's I don't think easy for those people necessarily to feel great about themselves. And your reputation, which is priceless, is worth everything. My reputation, for example, getting indicted normally would crush you, but people know the real me. People in the New York community, the business community, they do know the real me. And I was at a big investment bank yesterday, shaking hands and signing deals, because they said, we know that what you did was bullshit. And Trump as well, right? 4-time indicted criminal president. How easy would it be to run against that? But people are smart. They know this guy's not a criminal. They made him a criminal just for this. Yeah. In fact, it's backfiring. I'll vote even more for him.
I've stayed quiet all this time, but Martin, you're speaking to my heart. My name is Michelle. I work for the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who, as you may know, has dealt with many of these things you've described and still is. And I just am so impressed to hear your story. I'm so glad that Alex brought you on the space today. And you talk about Google. My boss is suing them every day. We have to have a lot of litigators to do that, and we're winning, by the way, millions, actually billions of dollars for the state of Texas. But we specifically have one case right now where we're trying to. It's a bipartisan case that is trying to break up the monopoly, because they are monopolizing and with what they're doing. And so we're not stopping those cases. We've been going forward with those. But my boss takes on such big giants, as you say, that they not only impeached him, but they've tried to indict him 3 times. They tried an FBI investigation. They've tried everything, although he's been cleared of all charges. But they don't stop. And not only that, they'll make law intentionally to go after you, just so you know. They do that in Texas anyway. They definitely do that, I think, at every state. But people need to know the weaponization of government is real. And I agree with you that we shouldn't go after everybody. But when you're watching what they do to you and how they lie about you, it's unbelievable. And it has to stop at some point.
Yeah, I was one of the few. I'm not a big antitrust person, so you're not going to win my heart. Sorry, Alex, you're on.
It's okay. It's okay.
Which is fine, agree to disagree. But, I was charged by the FTC, and maybe the first time in Alex, we can hear you clutter there.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all right. Just want to make sure you have the best listener experience. So I was charged with the biggest, the only case in recent history, the last 100 years, where under the Sherman Act, the Magna Carta of capitalism, where I was personally held liable for my company's alleged monopolization and wrongdoing. And, it's really remarkable, because many other actual cases of monopolization and wrongdoing, the company gets charged, the company pays a fine, and that's it. And so it's a really insane thing. Then the Supreme Court, through AMG v. FTC, struck down the ability for the FTC to get $1 from anybody. The monetary equitable relief was struck down, even though it had been the practice of the FTC to shake down companies for cash. It was made illegal, and it was clearly illegal from the start. And nevertheless, the FTC used the states to, particularly Letitia James, to grab me. So I know very well the creative use of law and the creative, basically it doesn't even
Yes.
matter what laws are in the books. All that matters is you got an argument, people want it, and the judge is there ready to stamp it, and that's all that matters. These judges have no, stomach for standing up to prosecutors and saying, no, the letter of the law says X. You're trying to say Y. I'm not ready to do that. Get out of here. This case is thrown out. It's just not what folks do. And that's why we have a Supreme Court. And it would be really nice if the Supreme Court expanded, not number of judges or anything, but the amount of cases they can do is so low and they take a couple percent of cases. And so many of the cases at the circuit level, as you may know, the circuit level just says, well, I have judicial deference. There was a judge in this case. The judge said the judge found for the plaintiff. How the hell am I supposed to, sitting here at the circuit level, going to reverse the judge's decision? I defer to them. What the hell is the point of an appeals court? It's this very...
They're out of control. I mean, they are out of control. You're right. I agree with you on
It's
that.
just hard to overturn. The reason we have activist judges is, I think somebody once said, the judge is the closest thing to God in America. And then obviously, not only is that inappropriate thing to say, but it's an appropriate thing that it even could be close to true, and it is true. If a judge rules against you in the district court, you have a 2% chance of winning on appeal, and you have a 5% chance of the Supreme Court even taking the case if you appeal. So it's a really brutal likelihood that you can reverse, and that's just one person's opinion deciding it. In my case, there's a fascinating judge. Her name is Judge Denise Coate, lovely lady. She ruled against me before our trial. She said, I have a decision. I made a decision. Do you want to hear it? She did this in a case against Apple as well, a monopoly case against Apple. She before the witnesses came on, she said, I've made a decision. Would you like to know? And Apple's attorney said, well, what? Yes, of course. What's going on? And she said, I found that you are a monopoly and you've monopolized, and that's how I'm going to rule. And the Apple people are scratching their heads saying, what the fuck are we doing here? If you decided already without seeing the evidence, without hearing the witness testimony, and this is all fact, you can find this in Coate's case, COTE. She did the same thing in our case, and we gambled. We said, we don't want to know your decision yet. Of course, she ruled against us, and we knew that, but we're going to put on our witnesses, maybe we'll change your mind. And, it's just a really remarkable thing that, one judge's methods can totally decide the fate of somebody for the rest of their life, or the fate of law in general for decades to come.
And it could be unconstitutional in their judgment.
That's the AMG case.
Let me be very clear, and I think General Paxton would agree if he was here too. I agree with what you're saying about the antitrust situation, and I believe in free markets. I mean, nothing works without free markets, right? And I loved what you said about how the cost of something changes. I mean, the cost is worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it, right?
Amen.
That's how you appraise it. But with Google in particular, they are the market, and they will literally shut businesses like your own down if you're not paying them enough to monopolize. I mean, sorry, what's the word? Like, get up to the top.
Yeah.
What's that word? And so that is stepping over a line of trust. You see what I'm saying? Because they are controlling literally how much you pay for things. Everything.
I'm with you.
Nobody knows.
And the nice thing about being Google is nobody's crying a tear for them. And you're
Right.
not crying many tears either, and they're doing a lot of things that are wrong. And when you pick on a small company, our company with that FTC case, very small company, and you put it out of business. I mean, you got $20-30 million of legal bills before you.
That's what I'm talking about.
You even start up. So if Google didn't do anything wrong, they can defend themselves. And if they win in the state of Texas,
well, they have the best lawyers. They can afford them, right?
Yeah. So the truth is supposed to come out in the courtroom, and if that's true, they should have no problem saying, no, you're wrong. We don't monopolize. Here it is. And if you're right, the judge will say you're right, and we'll see what happens. But we can't just play that game with every person and small business in America.
I agree. I agree with you. And I think General Paxton would agree with you too, that, we definitely believe in free markets and the price of stuff. I really appreciate
the rule of law. I mean, that's the beautiful thing.
Yes, absolutely.
As long as the accusation is merely an accusation. We are charging you with this. The courts will be the truth teller, not me, not you. We are going to go to the courts to find the truth. And you,
But we would hope the courts would follow the Constitution.
and
That's
again,
what you just said. And that's the problem we have right now
yeah,
is we have just judges in place that don't care about the actual Constitution. They care about politics of it, and that's how they play, just like Letitia James and the situation in New York. They're not playing fair by the rules.
they care
But if,
about what they feel the Constitution should be. It's a,
exactly, and that's wrong. So
yeah.
that's what we were fighting.
AMG
You
was a
know.
really interesting case. It was maybe one of the most important cases, I think, in the last 50 years, and at SEC v. Lou as well, where you had two three-letter agencies, SEC and FTC, and the district courts all said all the power should be with these guys. Because why? Well, all their friends work at these places. They worked at these places. They're government people. How in the world are they going to take power away from the government? So both of those cases went up to the Second Circuit. And both of those cases, the Second Circuit said the same damn thing. Well, how in the world are we going to stop, the SEC and FTC from doing their job? It doesn't make any sense. They both went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in AMG. 9-0. Even the most liberal people said the FTC has no right to take money out of the pockets of any company. They have the right to stop a monopolization, but they don't have the right to fine or take money. But the government had been using that for the last 50 years, just wanton fining
Prior
companies.
term doctrine. Is that what you're talking
Which
about?
one?
Prior term doctrine. Is
No,
that what you're
no,
talking
AMG
about?
is
Oh, I'm
equitable
sorry.
monetary
Okay.
relief from the Sherman Act. And the Sherman Act
Okay.
says that, you have injunctive relief. And that was interpreted to include equitable monetary relief. But injunctive relief just means it's an injunction. I can stop you. I can enjoin you from your monopoly. You have to stop bundling your browser with your software or whatever it is. And, but I can't say, and you have to pay me $1 billion.
And that's what Google's doing. And that's the whole problem is that you have to pay me all this money. I'm in control of all of the search engines, and I tell you what the market's going to go for. And they're pushing the cost down on consumers ridiculously.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the case. All I can say is that the great thing about the courts is they are supposed to be the fact-finding method, and everyone should stand behind the decision of the court because it's so darn fair. Of course, that's not the reality we're in, and when I went to criminal court, I said, listen, the truth will be spoken in this room, and we made the witnesses against us look so bad that our jury said 5-3, he's not guilty. And I was proud of that, even against some of the unfairness in these court systems. For example, the government gets to go first. It makes no sense. Anyone, and I know Alex would echo this, anybody that has studied anything about markets or psychology knows that there's something called recency bias. If you spend 5 weeks as a prosecutor explaining how bad, I think Michelle is the worst person ever. Here's some witnesses. Here's Michelle's neighbor. Here's Michelle's ex. Here's, and they just kind of keep bringing them on. And you're sitting there in the jury. You could be a complete angel, but by the time the 5 weeks are over, the person says, "Okay, I don't like this Michelle lady, and I think she's guilty."
They beat you down.
Yeah, and your defense attorneys now have to go up there to do damage control. Well, if the burden of guilt or the burden of proof is on the government, why do they win 99% of the time, and why do they get to go first? I think you should be able to state your case first, or have a coin flip, or something. But that recency bias is why it's a 99% guilt, because getting to go first is a hell of an advantage. You make the first impression on that jury, they're not changing their mind.
So I wanted to thank you, Martin, because I don't know if I brought this up at the beginning when you were on, but my son and I began talking about you, and I think he was in high school, and he had learned about your story and probably videos of you at Harvard or somewhere talking about what was going on, and he followed your case throughout its pendency. And so he would bring it to me, and I am a consumer of the Wall Street Journal and CNBC or whatever, and so I heard a very different story than the story I heard from my son, and it was really fascinating. It was almost like you were giving him sort of the alternative look into the law, into securities fraud or not fraud, and even into to pharma. And it was interesting where he was able to come and kind of have these interesting conversations with me, and a young guy, and it actually made us really close. And I think it formed a lot of like his thinking about how the government worked how the criminal justice systems work and so on. And so anyway, I just wanted to thank you for that, because we did spend probably an inordinate amount of time talking about your case. And what's funny is I think I knew a bunch of your investors. Like, I don't know, so Darren Blanton is a guy here in Dallas.
Yeah, I had a big Dallas contingent.
Yeah. And so I think at the time I knew people that were sort of involved, and like Darren's like, no, I made a fortune on that deal. I love it. And,
Yeah, I have a lot of words on that, but we'll leave the past in the past. But yeah, no,
sure.
a lot of the great Texas guys were some of my best investors because they refused to testify against me. And they one guy testified against me because these guys don't understand that when the government asks you to testify, you can say no, fuck you. And they will never put somebody on the stand that they haven't gone through rehearsal with. And that's a government witness versus a defense witness. It should just be a witness, a plain witness. And instead, they're choreographed. And in fact, we had witnesses who had like scripts prepared on how to answer questions. And so one of the Texas guys, a wonderful investor named John, and John goes up there and completely blows the government's case. The government says, well, Mr. Neal, is it true that you've invested in 100 hedge funds? He said, yes. And is it true that, this and that happened? He said, yes. And we go on there and we say, Mr. Neal, is it true that, well, actually, just tell us, what of 100 hedge fund investments you made, how does this one rank? And this guy with his Texas drawl says, well, I would say it was the second best I ever did. And I said, oh, well, we were sitting there, the jury's jaw drops. And he said, only better one maybe was Soros, I think. And I'm like, oh, all right, well, there you go. And then he says, and then we say, well, what percentage return was that? He said, well, I put in this much, got that much. It was about, what's that, 43.2? No, 43.4. And, again, the jury's, kind of jaws dropped. And they said, do you think there should be is there any problem here? And of course, the objection, sustained, can't ask that question. He answers it anyway. He says, Martin did nothing wrong. And he gets up and leaves. And it's this amazing Texas spirit that, I love going to Texas to raise money because those guys, a handshake in Texas is worth more than a 10,000 page contract in New York. And it's that kind of style. Now, I don't think Darren exemplified that, by the way, but in general, that's true, and that's why I love Texas and love Texas investors, especially.
Well, Darren's a big Democrat. What can you say, right?
Yeah, I don't know what to say about Darren other than
okay.
God bless him.
I will tell you, Texas is unique. When I was in my 20s, it was kind of like at the kind of tail end of the .com boom. I was doing a telecom startup, and I hung out with Kyle Bass when he was over at Bear Stearns, and he basically, I gave him my little prospectus, and I said, hey, I want to raise, I don't know, maybe $10 million. And so then he just started calling everybody up and saying, hey, there's this deal. It's a hot deal. You better get in it right away. And so before I knew it, he had been giving out the wiring instructions that I had previously given him.
Amazing.
And we had no docs. So there's nothing.
It would never happen. It would never happen in New York or San Francisco, ever.
Right. And so I had $14 or $15 million in my bank account. And finally, I had to give it all back because I said, look, I don't have any protection because,
I love it.
Anything could happen. So we ended up having to re-raise the money.
Only in Texas.
And then we had some people who we didn't go back to because I only wanted to raise 10,
right? But
we had gotten 15. And so then I ended up just asking the people I really liked to say, hey, come back in. And so we had raised 10. And then somebody who you've mentioned their name, but I'm not going to re-mention it on the space because there's people that don't like him, threatened to sue me if I didn't take at least $1 million from them. And so we had an $11 million raise as a result of being threatened to not do the investment.
Yeah, that's what America's all about is, free enterprise. And Texas has some of the most shrewd people who have common sense, and that kind of mentality, the handshake is your bond, your word is bond. It's, again, the only reason I still have a following, I still have investors, I still have thriving businesses, because your reputation matters a hell of a lot. And if you screw people, it doesn't matter if you contract your way out of it, and you escape the ultimate responsibility. The responsibility is on your name. And your name is what matters at the end of the day, because they could tar and feather you until the cows come home. But as long as people believe in you, I'm so lucky people like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, of course, Tucker Carlson and many others have stuck up for me in times when it was impossible to stick up for me. And, that's what, it means to be, a real, I was gonna say a real man, but really just a real person. Because if you're willing to stick up for somebody when they're being tarred and feathered, that's something that's, really unique. And Democrats kind of wanted to make that impossible. That was the cancel culture. And so I guess for people your kid's age and your son's age and that whole community at Harvard and so forth, I wondered why so many Harvard students want to hear from little old me. And the answer was, I think I presented them with ultimately there are two choices in life. You can go the way that the institution wants you to go, which is you're going to close your mouth, you're going to read the party line, you're going to do just fine. No one's going to criticize you, but you're going to live this dual life where the thing you really believe in, you're not going to say it. And then you're going to see this guy, Martin Shkreli. He's doing what he wants. He's saying what he wants. And he's flouting these people, telling them that, I don't care what you think, Hillary Clinton. Who the hell cares about what you think? How could he do that? That's impossible. It's insane. Is he crazy? And, those are the two choices. And one choice comes with some consequences, unfortunately. Sometimes you have to be, the climate is that you cannot bear that easily. You're going to get hit. And sometimes the climate is, as you were saying earlier about the meme coin guys, or even somebody, a good person who's had to go through both climates is Palmer Luckey. When Palmer was at Facebook, he sold his company to Facebook, probably our most brilliant entrepreneur in the country, head to head with Elon. He sold his company to Facebook, and Facebook fired him because he was a Republican. Insane. And then that climate was really adverse. That was my climate. And then he starts Anduril, and Anduril's 10 times more successful, 15 times more successful than Oculus was. Now the climate's good, and Palmer would tell anybody to fuck off right on Twitter if he doesn't like them. And so the climate's good for him. He's been through both climates. And sometimes, you just have to deal with, as long as you stay true to yourself, the climate might be good, might be bad, but, I'm me and I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And if you don't like it, that's that. And that's the kind of, again, Texas spirit that really is kind of something the rest of America should have some more of.
Yeah, I love Palmer. I think, I think it's good that he got fired from Oculus. Obviously, it was upsetting at the time, but to the extent that, he's rethinking about how we make military weapons, defensive weapons, whatever you want to call them. It used to be, we had contractors who would operate as general contractors and operate on, the products would be designed by generals who aren't product designers, and they would say what the requirements would be, and they would go get they would find a bunch of bidders and things. And Palmer's doing it the exact opposite way. Let me do product development. Let me hear what the needs are, and let me come up with the solutions, and I'll sell you those products. I think that's just such an obvious way to go about it.
Yeah, no, it's capitalism at its core, and I think what's funny about Palmer is, as much as it worked out for him, the firing, that's just the sign of a winner, right? A winner doesn't let that get him down, and he picked himself right off, dusted himself off, and said, "I'm going to do it 10 times better," and he did, and he's 30 something. I mean, it's really one of the greatest American stories ever. And, you're right about the defense industry and all that, but just what a man to kind of, pick himself up and make his own destiny, and I think 99% of Democrats and other folks who don't like that would say, he got lucky or something like that. And knowing Palmer well, one of the things that motivated him the most, believe it or not, was Jason Calacanis, basically a guy who hated him, who knocked him down every time he tried to do something, who tried to,
I was going to say there's no love lost there, by the way.
No, exactly. And in fact, talking to Palmer about it, I had a tiff with Jason too. And I said, Jason's being nice to me now. Jason likes me. He says I'm great. And Palmer says, don't let him off the hook. He knows that you're ascendant. He knows that. He doesn't want to repeat the same thing he did with me. Don't let these guys off the hook. Don't show any mercy. And, I'm just such a forgiving guy that it's hard for me to keep long-term vengeances like that. But it's like, it really is, that kind of thing that propels people. Jason was one of these people who, kind of like a Democrat, and I believe he's a Democrat voter, of course, just kind of wanted to control people and control the narrative instead of letting people self-determine. And, Palmer was so strong that he could beat that. But there's other people that aren't that strong. And the media can decide, people like Jason Calacanis can decide whether you succeed or fail. if you don't have the spine to stand up against them, they're now the kingmaker, and you're not self-determined. You're determined by somebody else. And I'm so glad that a lot of that edifice has crumbled. People like Madmani are going to bring some of that back, unfortunately. But, the rest of the country isn't buying it, including San Francisco, which, again, surprises the hell out of me. But you can be a Republican and raise $1 billion in San Francisco. You can be a Republican, you can be a Democrat CEO in San Francisco and break bread with the president and not get canceled or not get an employee revolt. In the old days, do you remember when Netflix, just for doing something like very innocuous, all the Netflix employees would walk out every week?
Oh yeah, all the time. It was insane. Yeah, literally, it is crazy.
And one day,
it's crazy.
The president of Netflix said, "Anybody that walks out's fired," and that's that.
Good for him. Well, I'll tell you, like with Jason, it must be so. Just and I'm just like everybody. I guess I'm a frenemy of Jason's, but the fact that his biggest success, which I don't know, it's probably debatable, but I think his biggest success. Is this All-In podcast, and he's being basically propelled by, whether it's libertarian or conservative feelings and this sort of like wave that's happening. It must be the most infuriating thing for him to have like his marquee achievement be the thing where it's David Sachs is and Chama, they're like driving forces behind his success.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, Republicanism in general is ascendant, and he sort of is even begrudgingly accepting this. But again, that's kind of where being a sycophant and a fair weather friend is the point. Like Jason, kind of famously sucks up to Elon, and I think Elon sort of looks at him as sort of this like, my friend who kisses my ass too much, and I can't sort of get rid of him, but I kind of like him and whatever. A real friend is somebody that sticks with you through thick and thin. And I think that, Jason's the kind of person that wants in on hot deals. He wants to be everybody's friend. And, he's not actually, at the end of the day, nobody's friend. And, that's to me, no matter how successful or unsuccessful his media empire, quote unquote, will become, I still feel bad for that person, and it shows up in the Twitter lawsuit where he's emailing Elon, "I'm your road dog. I'll do anything for you, bro." And it's like, yeah, for the richest man in the world, a lot of people will. And, were you his road dog when nobody wanted to invest with him in 2008?
No. So, of course, before All-In, his biggest accomplishment was I was in the seed round of Uber. And of course, a lot of us were in the seed round with Uber. I was in David Cohen's fund, and but they don't bring it up every single day. Jason, I think I've never been to an event where Jason didn't make that one of his key accomplishments.
Well, the other thing there is that was through Sequoia. That was a scout deal. So it wasn't.
Oh yeah, he was in the scout program.
It wasn't even his money.
Yeah, he had like 20 million, I think, to work with, and he made a $25,000 tag over there. So,
yeah,
which turns into real money, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you get the carry, I guess, but it's not like you took it out of your pocket and gave it to the guy.
Anyway, it's real easy to beat up on Jason, so I guess we probably shouldn't do that. Hey, it's 10:57, everybody. This is the Third Rail podcast. We've been joined by Martin Shkreli today, interesting investor, observer of human frailties and strengths. And I want to thank you all for coming today. We get together every Friday at 9 o'clock with Chris Salcedo and myself and Michelle and Sarah. And we just talk about what's going on. And we have a guest. I think next week we have the Assistant Secretary of DHS, Tricia McCaughlin. I think she's coming. We've got Sidney Powell coming on the following week. We got Corey DeAngelis and a bunch of other interesting guests. So I just wanted to thank Martin for coming. And if you have anything else you want to leave us with before we all close out for the weekend, please do. And again, thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you so much for having me, and I'll catch up with you separately. Thank you so much. Then thank you, Michelle, as well, and John.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Okay, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. See you next week.